Hello, this is another episode of Discussions with David, which is at this point a sort of sporadic interview show that I'm doing on various weekdays and generally starting at 10 a.m. or so Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. GMT. And it's all the episodes are archived on my YouTube channel and Facebook and Twitter, and you can watch on the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance and KBOO Community Radio, as well as on my various platforms. And if you look up the podcast This Week with David Rovics, you'll find all the episodes archived in audio form as well. And they're on SoundCloud and on Patreon, patreon.com/David Rovics, if you want to support the broadcasting efforts going on in this living room here in Portland, Oregon. And today we are spending the hour with longtime professor of political economy from currently living, I guess for quite a while now, in Western Massachusetts. And if you try to do a search for Terry Flynn on the internet, it's very challenging because there's a lot of people named Terry Flynn. I just discovered once again this morning in my efforts to do that. But luckily, I've known Professor Flynn for many decades, and I didn't need to do much research on him. And we'll just bring him in here right now. Terry, great to have you here on the internet with me.
Well, thanks for inviting me. Good to be here.
Thanks for joining me. And I think rather than trying to ask you any direct questions about the current state of affairs in the United States and our vastly shrinking economy and everything else that's going on, I just thought, can we start by can you just give a little stab at a summary of the state of the U.S. economy prior to the pandemic? Perhaps that would be a better intro, better sort of approaching this massive beast here called the U.S. economy.
Sure. Well, as probably anybody who follows the news at all knows, there was pretty steady increase in GDP, which is one of the standard measures of economic well-being. Although, as we also know, there was gross and increasing inequalities in income and wealth. So we were sort of a model in the world for growth among the developed countries, but also a model for how not to distribute both the wealth and income. We had the highest GDP in absolute terms in the world at about $21 trillion. Even China, with its over 1 billion people, it was less than about 15 or 16. But our growth rate was very high as well, as our dear leader had no trouble announcing and bragging about.
And then, but the overall impact on society of all of that varies tremendously depending on which end we're at. I mean, that's another feature of the U.S. economy, is that extreme stratification.
Yes, really exceptional. I think I'm quite certain we had the most extreme maldistribution of wealth and income of any OECD country, organization of economically advanced countries.
When I think the last reading assignment that I got from you, Terry, was Owning the Earth, this fantastic book, which really laid out the case for land ownership patterns historically, and how in cases where in societies where land ownership is terribly unequal, things just don't tend to go very well, and then things tend to go much better in places with more egalitarian patterns of land ownership. But I wonder, is that a good sort of place to start with? I mean, because we're currently, you listen to the business press, like we listen to Marketplace on NPR, which I do regularly, right? And I'm pretty sure you do as well. And they're talking every day. They're talking about how basically we're coming to this financial cliff at the end of July with the unemployment payments, the extra payments ending, and we're looking at up to 28 million evictions before the end of September. I mean, which just sounds like a untenable, ungovernable kind of situation to be in. And it's not necessarily the same situation happening everywhere in the world. Some of these, and not that I don't know how unique this disaster is to the United States, but it seems like at least in Europe, I'm not hearing about like half of society being evicted. But I don't know if you.
No, quite right. No, we'll talk about the EU. In the EU, there are really quite substantial safeguards to provide security in housing, whether it's through restrictions on what landlords can do, or with regard to subsidization of housing. So it's quite a different experience there. I mean, if you're a citizen of the EU, then you really have far more security in your housing than here. But to go back to your first point about the distribution of land and land tenure and land ownership, it is one of the fundamental divides in society, and is the difference between people who own land and who don't. And more precisely, it has to do with your tenure, your rights to occupy land, how that's handled in different countries. So we use the term landlord to refer primarily to people who own housing, which is always on land of some sort. And they're the people who rent the housing to the tenants. In economics, it's a little more precise than that. It's rather technical, which is land is the natural resources. The house is a produced resource. So the term landlord is a mixture of those two, which we can handle. But still, when it comes to a tenant or any citizen trying to live, eat, and breathe and work, what you need is a place to live, which includes both a space and shelter, of course, and various utilities and services. So I'm fine with it being conflated. I just wanted to, being a professor, I wanted to take a minute to pull those two bits apart for a moment.
Yeah, it seems especially, very relevant right now. But it seems like, 2008, I've read one of the things they were talking about on Marketplace recently was how in 2008, there were a lot of companies that probably should have just gone bankrupt, but have been kind of carrying along since then because of the extremely low interest rate on borrowing, and
Right.
but they basically they have debt that they'll never possibly be able to repay, and now there's going to be a lot of those companies going bankrupt, they said.
Yes, that sounds right.
I wonder if can you just try to give a picture, because I think people who don't have a training in economics. I mean, I don't know. I don't know even if you have a lot of training in economics, whether how well you can sort of understand what our situation is that we're facing right now. But it seems like there's a lot of calamities around the corner, and the government or various entities of the state are trying to prevent the sort of calamities from happening right away. Is that basically?
We have a very interesting bit of history in this, because you don't have to go back to the Great Depression or the Wall Street crash in 1929. You can just go back to 2008 and see some very strong similarities. The government stepped in and really helped to maintain what they call aggregate demand, that's spending in the economy. They helped to provide a financial foundation for many banks, in hundreds of billions of dollars worth of support. And we know that works in the sense it keeps those firms alive. Some of them shouldn't have been kept alive, to be sure, but it does work when the central bank or the Treasury Department steps in and provides those sorts of funds. They did similar work in the EU as well. But this problem that's happening right now is far greater. That is, quantitatively, it's a much, much bigger issue. And it's so much bigger that we can talk about this word that's overused, unprecedented, because it's happened. It's so big, so fast. Talking about something like a 30% drop in spending and production. So it's so we're in kind of new territory empirically, although I think the theory and institutions are up to comprehending it and dealing with it. It's just that it runs into lots of problems, institutional and ideological.
Right. because it really just kind of the whole neoliberal model gets kind of thrown against the wall and bloodied badly. I mean, it doesn't necessarily work, right? That's great with the dog. The dog is
I have to get the dogs out of
very
here.
high pitched bark too.
Hang on, Hanson, could you remove the dogs to that room, please? And just lock him out there. Thank you.
Excellent.
Banish the pooches. Sorry.
Ever since the dogs, I mean, it had the ambassador so-and-so has their dogs barking and, BBC World Service in the background. They're all doing the home interviews now. So it's not just us amateurs.
No, I got it. And I anticipated this and thought it was taken care of, but we're okay.
Mm-hmm.
But back to the quantity, I want to say two things. You mentioned the problems with housing and people of foreclosures. Foreclosures have been on epidemic proportions before the pandemic. I mean, millions of foreclosures every year.
Starting in 2008, especially, or
yes. Well, no, it was been building up. Not starting there, but really, it's been a gradual buildup. And there was a tremendous number of foreclosures on homeowners. But then there are these things of evictions. So all the renters, which are largely the poorer people in the U.S., it's homeowners are almost exclusively people with higher incomes, and the renters are overwhelmingly people with lower incomes. So we've had this tremendous rise in evictions before the pandemic. And now with this financial cliff, this is it. This is the day, right? July 31st. The end of those unemployment subsidies. We could be facing 10 million evictions, at least eviction filings. There already millions have been filed in the last few weeks as the subsidies dropped, and we could be looking at as many as 10 million in just the next few months being filed. And they often move very quickly, and they're even doing them by video now. So I'm really concerned that millions of families will be pushed out on the streets with nowhere to go in a very short period of time.
But when's the last time when's the last time there's been that many evictions all at once? I mean, would this also be unprecedented? I mean, I'm not as far as I know, the 1930s, we're talking about comparisons like the Great Depression situations.
Yep, that's true. No, that's it. You'd have to go back to the 1930s to find that sort of proportion of evictions. But it was much slower in the way it developed.
In the 30s.
Yeah, in the 30s. It took years for it to get really bad.
So if all this could happen, if we could actually have tens of millions of evictions in the space of a few months, I mean, obviously, it seems like a lot of leaders at the federal level and state level realize this is untenable, and so they've been passing eviction or declaring eviction moratoriums or suspension of evictions. But then, I know that just happened in some of the places where there's been a lot of these Zoom evictions going on, like Arizona. They just extended. There's now a new moratorium on evictions that goes until the end of October. And I think, it's a conservative run state, but it doesn't seem to matter. They realize, it seems, this is untenable. You can't just be evicting everybody. But then what the alternative, in any kind of real alternative, we're going to be having to talk about an alternative to the neoliberal no rent control anywhere kind of model, right? I mean, a real radical change.
At minimum, what they'll have to do is provide subsidies. Now, this being a capitalist country, what they're going to do is bail out the landlords. But if the deal is that they don't throw people in the streets, I'll take it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Right? So, because the point is the landlords do have these property rights, and they have bills to pay as well. So if what the government does is make sure the landlords aren't bankrupted and the building lacks services and become uninhabitable by the tenants, well, in that case, helping the landlords is a good idea. We just have to think pragmatically, not ideologically. We want people to be sheltered and fed, right? We all agree on that. And that's true for conservatives. They really are not happy with starving women and children in the streets. And then they also know that when you put people through that kind of stress, there'll be mass violence.
Right.
Not peaceful protests. There'll be mass violence.
No, all
People
kinds of
do not
possibilities.
they do not take to their children starving and dying of exposure quietly. So
that's when you have the bread riots, and
exactly. It would, and so they don't want to have to deal with that. Just as but there are cities throughout the country in the 1930s that made concessions that were completely against their ideology, but they did it just to protect the property and the power system.
Like Chicago banned evictions.
Yep.
Yeah. But like when we talk about in terms of there's been so much investment in real estate going on for quite a long time, right? It's one of the most profitable things that a capitalist can invest in, right? And so it's a big return on your investment, if you're doing that right.
Well, if you do it right, if you do it from the profit making perspective, but you can easily lose fabulous amounts of money. And as we know from the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, that there were millions of low-income homeowners who went under and lost everything.
But then companies like Blackstone, they are really, they bought up all that, right? They swept in and they bought up all those assets, and then they're making extreme profits, right? And really increasing they seem to be maximizing what they can charge for rent in the same kind of way that they liquidate their assets when it comes to forests. Some of the same companies, they just say, okay, cut down everything. We're not thinking about the future, and they just seem to be. I don't have all the numbers handy, but my impression is that when they have the opportunity to raise the rent 10% a year, they'll just keep doing that and transforming places. Yeah. So if they're following this model of maximizing profit and charging so much more than they were charging even like 10 years ago, I'm just trying to. I can't get my head around. I don't know if you can get your head around what would be involved with the government actually subsidizing that much. That's just a vast. So many people. It's 70% of what they make. There's giving to the landlord, and we're talking about the government taking on all that, or would they have to say, okay, now we got rent control. We're not paying you back for all. We're not subsidizing everything. We're subsidizing a portion of it.
Well, fortunately, it's decentralized. These rules are decentralized, so every city has some say on this. The state governments would be their highest authority for what's legal at a local level. So some state governments put rather severe limitations on rent control laws, local rent control laws. But you have a lot of possibilities at the local level in terms of degrees of rent control, the condition policies regarding evictions. And of course, if the federal government, which is the only source that has the funds, were to come in and subsidize, they might very well put restrictions on it. Say, okay, we're going to subsidize, but only under these circumstances, where the rent is reasonable, where it's controlled, where the landlords aren't going to be able to pocket a windfall and then cash out. There's a whole lots of ways it can be exploited, and of course, we can guarantee it will be exploited by some. But there's a potentially democratic process that would allow communities to at least control to some degree the transfer of funds to just pure profits for the landlords.
That would be a really big transformation for the U.S. economy if there were those kinds of controls put in place, like compared to how things have been for a long time, right? It's those controls are largely not in place, it seems.
Well, it's a matter of degree, because you do have rent control in many cities around the country, including New York City, and I believe Portland has a degree of rent control, doesn't it?
It's technically rent control has been banned in 48 out of 50 states. So it's mainly New York and California that has rent control, but Portland has, but they've unbanned it sort of in Oregon. It's in the courts now. Portland has a 10% limit on increasing rent every year, which is But 10% is totally crazy because
Oh
whose
God.
wages goes up by 10%, you know?
Yes.
And of course, if you're in many industries, your wages are plummeting, you know, like say my industry.
Yes, exactly.
If you're a musician, forget it, you know. But it's yeah. But Terry, I know you're looking at how things are going during the pandemic in other countries, and I wonder if you have any particular reflections on other countries that are handling this meltdown better or worse, or anything
Oh
that
yeah.
comes to mind. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got connections with Italy, France, and Germany personally, and friends in England as well. So I've also been reading about it. So um, I personally am really impressed with how the Italians managed it. You know, the first kids on the block to really get nailed. Terrible, terrible suffering, but a degree of social cooperation that I never expected from my friends in Italy, who are just they have this tremendous history of being scofflaws, and just they're so anti-government for lots of good reasons. But for some reason, they showed a lot of unity and cooperation and spirit. And as we all know, Italy's got the numbers way down. They're opening up the economy again, and have served as kind of a model for what you can do in Europe. And many other countries have done quite well too, like Germany, of course. Some countries have tried another system, like Sweden, trying to just let it run its course and see how that went. And then, of course, you have our mini Trump in England with Great Britain with
Mm-hmm.
everybody's hero. Yeah. So
higher death rate than here, I think.
Yeah, exactly. It's very impressive, you know,
Mm-hmm.
how badly you could manage it, given those wonderful examples right there in Western Europe.
Mm.
So Boris Johnson is just, in some ways, may make Trump look good, which is kind of hard, but I'm not going to really go that far. Just the same, I have seen and been very pleased with how so many countries have handled it well. I'm a little shocked by how badly it's gone in France, and in Paris. They're being really irresponsible right now. I have two godsons, and one of my best friends is there, and he said really about a month after the peak, people were just crowding in cafes. Nobody's wearing a mask, just sunbathing and smooching along the Seine. So that doesn't really look all that good. But then I
Denmark,
followed what's happened in Europe, of course. I'm sorry, in Asia,
yeah,
which is just brilliant.
also
Vietnam got its first case.
right.
Just got its first case. Imagine that, the discipline it took.
Yeah.
For the government and the people to hold off that long.
And Cuba also, it's gone very well.
I haven't followed the Cuba example.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, they've done
they
well.
got medics going door to door all the time, and
Yeah.
like big human, massive human involvement, kind of like following the same kind of model with Vietnam and China.
Yeah.
I think.
I want to say one thing about Europe is that one of the lessons is that they weren't nearly as prepared in terms of medical systems as they were famous for. They've got this reputation for having a far superior medical system to the U.S., and a lot of its weaknesses showed up. And then we started finding out that they've been methodically gutting it over the last 10 or 15 years. That was news to me. I didn't know that, because my friends in Europe have been getting great health care throughout this whole period, but they've had ordinary challenges, and whereas this is a big challenge. And then we find out that actually they've been just letting all the pandemic preps just go to waste.
Right. From an economic perspective, I think Denmark has done this thing where they've just the government has kind of subsidized everything in terms of wages and companies and everything, right?
Yes,
just
brilliant. It's just brilliant. Yeah, it's really brilliant, because this way there's no economic destruction. When people can go back to work as demand comes back, when the health environment allows for them to get back to work fully, the jobs are there, the business is there, all the productive capacity is in place. You don't have this massive destruction of productive capacities we have here. So yeah, I think it's a great move.
you've seen, and from also like personally, differences in how the pandemic lockdown economy has affected different kinds of people in society. And you're as a sort of self-employed small business person, it's been okay for you, this the pandemic, but people are still playing pianos and
Right. I feel guilty about not suffering with many of the people in my field, because as the viewers can see, there's a grand piano right behind me, because that's how I support myself now, is by repairing and selling pianos, largely high-end pianos, Steinway grand pianos. I'm in a very good area for that here in Western Mass, near Tanglewood Music Festival and all that. And what's happened is that with the shutdown, all the music, all the theater, all the concerts, even TV stuff has all been shut down. People are not recording either video or sound recordings or live performances. It's all been shut down. So all the people in my side of the music business who are relying on piano tuning, for example, or concert services, just lost their income entirely, just completely without any income. But my own business is very diversified, because we actually sell pianos, we rent them, we tune them, we repair them. So my entire crew haven't missed a day of work or a dollar of income, so which I'm very, very pleased about. And so I'll just tell you one story. One well-known concert musician whose entire 3 months of gigs were canceled, moved out of New York into a cottage belonging to a friend of hers up here. And she just took our concert grand piano and put it in her cottage. So she's been renting it for the whole time. So we didn't even lose any income from our concert piano. And she's been recording Instagram concerts. And sometimes with as many as 30 or 40,000 people paying to hear her Instagram concert.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. Isn't that wild?
She's got it down. That's great. That, if you can make the internet work like that.
Yeah. Just it's wild. She's bloody gorgeous, great pianist, and she knows her internet stuff. She was actually started out doing coding for Google back in her teens, and then she's a multi-genius. She taught herself to play concert piano, almost unheard of for someone to have a concert career without a teacher.
I've never heard of one.
Yeah, there are a couple. There's a famous Russian pianist. His name will come to me later, but there's one Russian pianist who's self-taught and world-renowned. Anyway, so
Terry, one of the people that you've turned me on to is 19th century writer and newspaper editor and economist Henry George. And I wonder, I know there's a lot of people looking for alternatives to the failing model currently here. And I wonder if what does Henry George have to say about what's happening 150 years after his death? If he were resurrected today and got his bearings, what would he say about what's going on?
Well, let me say briefly, his insight during the late 1800s was that land speculation was driving down wages, increasing homelessness, and distorting the production and distribution of wealth. And his solution that he offered and ran as a politician for mayor of New York City, by the way, was on a simple platform that came to be known as the single tax. He felt that the land really should be common property, and that it was in every respect common property, but he understood that we had to have individual or group title to specific areas of it, whether for farming or for business or for homes. You had to have secure title to use the land, and that's called tenure. And in all countries, you have different forms of land tenure. He felt that we should continue with private forms of land tenure, land holding, but the actual ownership should be collective, and all the income that goes from holding land, not from doing your business, but from holding land, all that income should be shared collectively through taxes. and should be used to provide social services. So that's pretty much his position in a nutshell. He had a lot of support in that period, late 1800s. Lots of famous people, from Leo Tolstoy, to I'm so bad on names right now, forgive me. But George Bernard Shaw, for example, yes, and the Fabian Socialists. These guys thought George was the dog's bollocks, and they, to use an English
wonderful expression.
So anyway, if he looked at what's happening now, I think he would say, yeah, this is predictable. This extreme division of wealth and income, the fact that people are just paying through the nose for a place to live or work, or that would be completely consistent with our form of land tenure, which is what's known as fee simple land ownership. You buy it, you own it, you pay taxes, but they're a small proportion of what would be the rental income from the land. And that inspires people to speculate. And in this process of speculation, it deprives people of access to land at reasonable rates.
And with speculation, like how much? I mean, how much of our problem today is based on speculation and is speculation? That's one of the phenomena that really drives up prices. It sort of creates bubbles and unnaturally high and impossible prices. Huh?
Yeah.
And
we have these booms and busts in real estate. They're often bubbles, people buying all this property, expecting it to rise and rise and rise, and then it stops rising, and a whole bunch of people go bankrupt, lose property, and then the people know what they're doing, and they swoop in, they capture it. So yes, it's a common bubble. It's a cycle in real estate. And
this cycle, if it just keeps on going, then left unchecked, you kind of end up with what we're looking at now.
Well, we end up with booms and busts. You end up with massive foreclosures. You end up with concentration in ownership. It's like most booms and busts in the general business cycle. When there's a bust, the big guys get bigger, and you weed out the smaller ones, and so power and wealth get concentrated. And this is what's happened to a large extent with real estate, as with many other things.
As with like the economy generally too, right? But
that's highly concentrated.
And that's been that phenomenon has been controlled to a large extent because of government spending and regulation since the Great Depression.
No, government spending doesn't really control concentration. It does. You can still. It's just the spending. The profits are still concentrated. It's just that by government spending, you can maintain employment, but you're also maintaining profits as well as wages. And there was that kind of partnership between unions and the government, as part of the New Deal, where they said, okay, we're going to protect unionization, but you have to play nice with the capitalists. Make sure that you don't demand so much money that they aren't happy enough with their profits to work with us. Mm-hmm. It's gotten quite a bit wilder since Reagan. The restraints on the capitalists are fewer restraints, to be sure, and fewer restraints, and the degree of restraint is much less.
And then after 2008, there were some changes made, but basically the same problems continue.
I don't see that we are. Let me put it this way. There is still the boom and bust. There's people speculating. It was just going to talk about real estate. We could talk about stock markets too. There is still a tendency to speculate, and there's still a tendency for things for values to bubble, and then for there to be a burst. We saw this tremendous drop in the stock market, for example, at the beginning of the pandemic. Some people made out really well with that. Some people lost all their savings, nearly all. With regard to housing, it's you have to look at individual markets. Right now, there's a kind of a bubble. There's a real increase in sales of housing now because the interest rates are so low. I don't know if people are noticing that, but because interest rates are so low, it's helping to support and to some extent amplify sales in the housing market.
Because people, when the interest rates are so low, that people are more looking at what they're going to be having to pay back a month to month, and it's
Yes.
not, the overall price isn't such a concern, which is always hard for me to get my head around.
Right. No, because what matters to you is what you're having to take out of your income.
Right.
There's big dangers in that, of course, because people will be lending you money over very long periods of time, and in the end, you realize you've paid half your payment has been towards interest, or maybe even more.
Even if it was a low interest rate, if you'd spread it out over enough time.
Yeah.
But then it kind of seems to, like, there's a lot of, I hear people talking about different sort of bubbles, like that we're all going to be coming to a head with credit card debt at some point. With like at some point, it's just not, it kind of comes due. You can't keep on rolling it over.
Well, that's going to have to do. There are things to interact there. There's what's happening to people's income, what the interest rates are. This all really matters, and the various rules regarding what credit card companies can do to debtors. They're less and less restricted now, and how they can attach people's income and take their property and so on. So it's becoming, the power is gradually shifting towards the credit card companies and the lenders. So, for example, in some areas now, if you declare bankruptcy, it doesn't clear your credit card debt.
Wow.
Exactly.
I thought that was kind of the point, but no.
You would think so, but there are areas now in law, there are certain situations where your credit card debt can't get away from it. Just like your school debt, you can't, if any of your federally subsidized school loans, they're not cleared by bankruptcy. As far as I'm not
right.
a lawyer.
I've heard about the school loans. Yeah.
Yes, but there's a degree of credit card debt now that you can't clear. So I mean, I can't give you references on that. It's just part of my reading.
Right.
So I'm afraid that the creditors are getting more and more power, and a lot of what the Dodd-Frank restrictions and the consumer financial rights that were established by Elizabeth Warren and that agency in Washington, that's really been held back and undermined, of course.
Right.
So that was a large part of Elizabeth Warren's shtick was about protecting consumers from rapacious lenders. And
then the head of that department that was formed because of her efforts, I think Trump wants to get rid of that person, but can't. Is that, I can't,
has to do with who you get to the executive control over who's the head of the department. Yes, I don't know where that stands right now.
Right.
I know he wants to put someone in who will just abolish its power. So just make it ineffective. Without effectively eliminating the agency, just make it ineffective. That would be good enough.
The number of acting heads, all these acting heads that have not been, it's a really interesting and alarming situation.
Yeah.
There's certain historical parallels there. But have you looked at the this multi-trillion-dollar bailout package that's gone through, which I guess this increase in unemployment money is part of that, but so much of it went to big corporations, I believe, and I don't know if you've looked at where that's going to.
Talking about the first,
the first, the first big one.
I've only gone as deep as the New York Times has. So actually, but as we expected, something on the order of half has gone to people whom you and I would say don't deserve it.
Right.
Maybe $500 billion went to, but on the other hand, $500 billion did go to people who really, really needed it. Piano tuners, for example, and a few musicians.
Right. but that's interesting. Why it's as far as you can tell, half of it did go to useful purposes. Because I've heard much worse.
Well, there may be. I'm sure there are people who've really been in the details. I have not.
And we just passed a new military budget, which is, I believe, the biggest in the history of the world, as far as I know. I think $27 billion bigger than last year's record military budget. So I think we're still below 800 billion a year, but
that would be a small percentage increase. Might just be keeping up with the cost of gunpowder.
Yeah.
Joking,
Yes.
But, yeah. $20 billion increase is nothing in Washington.
Right.
For such a big program, right?
Although it's many times the size of some countries' GDP.
Yes, exactly. Right. I want to go back for a moment to something you mentioned about debt, because there's not only the credit card debt, but there's this student debt, which is now according to the statistics coming from Washington, it's over $1 trillion.
God.
Over $1 trillion in student loan debt. That's pretty wild. And I know for years students have been borrowing tremendous amounts of money. I mean, tens of thousands of dollars. I mean, in the case of medical students, sometimes over 100,000. And it isn't all from sham universities like Trump U or, it's not just shams. I mean, from real colleges who give real degrees. And of course, so many of these young people aren't able to earn enough money to pay their damn student loans. And so this was one of the multiple time bombs, financial time bombs. So I'm really worried about how the problems with this disastrous decline in income is going to affect these various areas of potential default. Both on
like
student
the
loans,
student loans,
you can't get away from them,
right?
And then the credit cards,
and then rent is another one.
So these are very big portions of the economy. And it's about a $22 trillion annual GDP. So that's the total value of goods and services produced.
So the student loans really factors into that in a big way, as does credit.
Yeah, that would be 5%. That would be 5% of the GDP if it's $1 trillion. Credit card debt. Well, that's another 5%. If it's around $1 trillion.
And what about like foreign university students in this country is a massive industry, right? That's being also threatened in various ways.
Well, that's a funny one because, of course, we know our dear leader doesn't give a hoot about learning or universities. He's so profoundly anti-intellectual, anti-education. So I think he'd be happy if all the universities went bust, except for the profit-making ones, that are just in it for the money, like Trump U. Mm-hmm. That said, as we generally know, the many American colleges and universities really depend on foreign students who are paying full fare. And that's just about to it's drying up right now. That money that was supposed to be paid as tuition for the upcoming semester from all those foreign students with foreign visas, that'll disappear if the students are online, if there's online teaching. So that's part of the dance that the colleges have to perform. They have to figure out some way of having a curriculum, a way of teaching that will allow the foreign students to stay and continue to pay full fare, which is easily $100, $200, maybe even $300,000 for the course of their education.
Listening to Marketplace and reading other business press, one of the things that's kind of entertaining about it over the past few months is how often they're using adjectives that they never used before, as far as I know, like talking about precipice and nosedive.
Yeah,
cliff. They're
running off the cliff.
Cliffs. We're always running off cliffs nowadays, but what if we're on a cliff? It's July 31st, 2020. We're actually standing on a virtual cliff. And the Republican Party is divided among themselves, right, over this as some kind of a new bailout, right? So I guess most Republicans support this, but not enough necessarily to make it pass. And I'm not sure unless the Democrats are just going to support this Republican proposal rather than trying to negotiate for something bigger. I don't know. I guess eventually they probably will rather than do nothing. But I mean, this is just, you're hearing them talk about we're at a cliff, but no, nothing's being done about it. Here we are on this cliff. I mean, what if they can't agree on another bailout? Like, what if we have to wait until, say, I mean, it seems conceivable. What if it's not until a new administration is actually, if there's an election and if the results of the election are recognized and if the other party wins?
A lot of ifs.
That's a lot of ifs. But I mean, in some ways that might be some kind of a terrible but best case situation, and then some kind of competent response to the whole economic and health crisis maybe starts taking form in January, which is like, but between now and January, it's just feels like 1917. What do you think? Right. What do you think? You got any thoughts, predictions for the future?
No, I don't do predictions, but
no, that's smart.
I'm happy to describe the forces at play as I see them.
Yeah.
First of all, I can't imagine people going without housing, food, clothing, and shelter until January. And
right.
So there has to be some way. There has to be a system for providing them with sustenance and shelter, at minimum. And right now there isn't. As of tomorrow, there's a delay. In other words, all these things take a little while to happen, to develop. So you stop providing funding, supplementary funding to people. So what happens? Some of them get thrown out of their houses. The marshals will come, landlords will take off the door, and that's it. They have to go out. They have to leave, or all terrible things happen to them in their house at night. They have to leave to get safe. So that'll happen to a small number of people at first, and it could happen more and more and more. And then there are the potential for riots that I mentioned. On the other hand, if people are lacking the income they need to get food banks will try to step up. There may be a big push for provide food for free, or subsidized food. There'll be all sorts of real efforts to keep people from suffering. So it'll be kind of a gradual catastrophe. We have this picture of the brink, and we have brinkmanship, which is, of course, what's happening in Washington. So I see it as if they actually went from here to January without any subsidies, I can't imagine actually getting to January without subsidies. Something would have to happen. There'd be so much violence. So I think long before the banks were all burned down, there would be some compromise achieved.
Right. What's so hard to imagine, given the many, many ways that society is divided, along so many different lines, is like, if there weren't any kind of bailout coming from the government on the federal level, and it was just left up to the devices of social movements and community organizations and municipal governments and whatever. I mean, I wonder what form the further divisions in society might take. I mean, just like yesterday, I believe 5 protesters were shot in different parts of the country, and it's just such a volatile atmosphere. I know this isn't a question about economics necessarily, but it is too, because the volatility is based in economic, a sort of a caste system that's being more and more exposed. Huh?
Oh, especially for blacks. This is my favorite book they just finished recently was The New Jim Crow,
which is once again a bestseller after 10 years.
Yeah, 10-year anniversary edition. I read the 10-year anniversary edition. Couldn't be more timely, of course.
And there's a lot of economics in there too. Huh? I mean, in terms of like the economics of the oppression of Black people over the decades and centuries.
Yeah, and this how the systematic oppression of Black people has so many effects, including, of course, the economic effect of stigmatizing them, making it impossible for them to get subsidized housing, or even jobs. Jobs are subsidized housing, much less not being able to vote and so on. So once you've been incarcerated, often through doing things that shouldn't be illegal in the first place. For example, all these drug crimes, just for possession of things. That said, underlying the whole oppression is a structure that keeps people poor and disenfranchised. And I think that has everything to do with the Black Lives Matter business. Of course, murder really matters too, to be sure, but there's this tremendous tension. So
here in Portland,
go ahead.
The average Black family in the United States cannot afford to live in a 2-bedroom apartment at the average rate in Portland, like the one I'm sitting in right now.
My understanding is that's pretty much true in all parts of the country, that the average Black family can't afford a 2-bedroom apartment. I'm not sure. I know it's really bad. It's really hard.
Mm-hmm. And then now the way that things are being sort of exposed with the economic pressures, and how disproportionately that's playing out in terms of Black and brown people. It's really quite something. 87% of slaughterhouse workers are people of color, which is where the farm workers' situation is the same.
Yeah.
And then with housing, who are the renters in this society as well?
Yeah. Well, of course, it's the minorities, it's lower income people, lower income whites and colored people of color are much more likely to be renters than homeowners.
Mm.
I'm thinking about how this this economic pressure is building up. I know what I want to say. This is it. The federal government has the financial capacity for endless subsidies. There's just no ceiling to it. They can just issue funds just electronically. No locality and no state has that power.
Right.
The U.S. can take just vast amounts of debt on without it changing much at all for them. I mean, there are really important arguments for keeping it at a reasonable rate that has something to do with the potential for growth and all that. But in times like this, you need this tremendous input to keep up a demand and to raise people's standards of living. And there's very little that can be done at the local and state level. They
right.
don't have the money. They don't have the borrowing power.
They're not even allowed to go into debt, right? Under the law.
Many states are not allowed to. Some can. Deficit spending is permitted in some states in the U.S. It's a very complex bit of law. I was just read a paper on it. So it varies quite a lot from state to state.
And to some extent, is the ability of the U.S. federal government to print money kind of unique to the United States because it's the world's reserve currency? Because it looked like the bailout package that was worked out on the EU level, it looked a lot different from what they're doing in Washington in terms of how they're financing it.
Yes, they're not just printing money. They're doing a lot of it. Approximately half of it are loans, as you probably read. That's the latest I saw about it. About half of it is loans. So that's an attempt to try to reduce the amount of new funds.
But here it's all about loans, right? And printing new money?
No. Well, it's this government. Here's the thing. In Europe, the central banks, the EU central bank is loaning money to the member countries. About half of the subsidies are loans, so they're supposed to pay them back to the central bank. What's happening in the U.S. is not that. A very small portion of this is loans. An awful lot of it is just grants, or grants that will turn, or money that's given to companies, for example, on the condition that they use it to provide employment. If they do, then it becomes a grant and it does not need to be paid back. A lot of the money that's been dispersed is under those conditions.
But the money in the first place that they're using for the grants, what is borrowed in the first place?
And it's the Treasury is providing these funds, and there's a bit of financial magic going on.
Right. That's what it seems like.
But they don't actually have to go out and borrow it from anybody. The government puts it on the Treasury's lending the money, but they didn't have to go and take the money in from anywhere. They can in a sense, can just create the money and then lend it out.
But what would happen if another country tried to do that? Like a small country, like then they'd suffer incredible inflation all of a sudden.
That's true. Exactly. They would have what they'd have. First off, they may not have inflationary problems, but they'd have a problem with their currency being devalued.
Right.
That's the biggest limit on countries screwing with their currency, doing this kind of deficit spending, or these kind of stimulus. The U.S. doesn't seem to have that problem. I mean, we do have our international exchange rates matter, and there's some limits on that, but we have a great deal more power than any other country. Now, of course, the EU, the euro is an international currency. It's really important. They've got a good bit of flexibility, but the Chinese currency doesn't have anything like that power, much less. The yen has some, but I would say the U.S. has the most freedom with what it does with its currency internationally, and the EU second with the euro. I know.
Terry, have you thought about if you were designing a course to try to help students understand the current historical moment? Have you thought about like where you would start, or what period you might focus on, or what aspect of the situation you'd be focusing on to help people understand it?
Well, yes. I always, when I teach anybody anything about economics, I try to get them grounded in the real world, which is where people are actually using their labor power to produce goods and services, and trying to get a sense of what the material foundation is of our lives, and then understand the social relations. I mean, it's just basic Marxism. The productive relations and social relations of production. So I want them to not conflate financial wealth with sort of tangible wealth, nominal values versus use values. So I'd want to get in there, have them get them grounded in that, and to understand, most importantly, to start with, the difference between land values and the value of a music lesson or a cooked meal or a house. That's just kind of fundamental to any understanding of economic life. As to understanding this moment, I would want them to get a grasp on the development of the government's involvement in the economy, which is largely a 20th century story. It was pretty laissez-faire up until World War I, and then it didn't really change until the Great Depression and the New Deal. It was the country pretty much let people just starve, go bankrupt, go homeless, and just die.
But there's been a precedent. There's been some kind of a precedent set now that's not really acceptable in terms of the government efforts to feed people during the last Great Depression. So they'd have a harder time just letting people die now, huh?
I think so. I think it's not quite as acceptable to have mass homelessness, migration of farmers to California. That's just not acceptable anymore. I think to have the grain belt just sort of pull up, drive out to California. It's not. The governor of California would be really unhappy about that.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know why they'd go anyway. Live in a tent in San Francisco. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. No, I think there are certain limits that even Republicans acknowledge. I think these days.
Yeah.
Mass starvation in the streets. It's just not good news. It's not good PR.
Fox not good News for business.
Might broadcast those images.
Terry, thanks so much for joining me for the hour. It's been a pleasure.
It was a pleasure talking to you, David. Thank you so much for asking me.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
See you around. Bye. This has been another episode of Discussions with David, and that was Professor of Political Economy, Terry Flynn, and they're in Western Massachusetts. I just thought we'd talk and try to make a little sense of the current historical economic moment precipice we're on. I'll be back doing more broadcasts next week, Fifth Estate Live on Tuesday, and then I'll be talking to other people on various other days of the week. And you can find all this archived on the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance, KBOO Community Radio, my own Facebook and Twitter, VK, Twitch, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And if you look for This Week with David Rovics on any podcasting platform, you can find the audio version, as well as at patreon.com/David Rovics, where you can also support my broadcasting efforts. Thanks for joining us, and hope to see you around. Don't pay the rent. Mutual aid will get us through. Bye for now.